In his autobiography, Benjamin Franklin famously quipped that God helps those who help themselves. The phrase has become so widespread that many Americans actually think that this is in the Bible. A survey by the Barna Group found that 68% of born-again Christians agree with the statement. It sounds very inspirational and very American, but it's actually, and I'm glad to say it on this day, the very opposite of the Christian gospel. The message of the cross is not that God carries the burdens of those who carry their own burdens. Not at all. On Good Friday, we see that God helped the helpless. God gave aid to the hopeless at great cost to himself. And this is made especially clear in our first lesson from Isaiah 53. If you have a Bible, you might want to follow along. Isaiah was a Jewish prophet who lived nearly 800 years before Jesus. And his prophecy gives us a gritty and realistic picture of the human condition. Remember, he's the one who had this vision of himself in the heavenly throne room where he saw the glory of the Lord, and his first words were not, "Oh, great, so good to be here." His first words were, "Woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips." He had a gritty and realistic vision of human nature, the human condition. He saw the failures of his own society and his own personal failures, and he saw that they were so widespread and so deeply rooted that no amount of self-help or course correction would possibly fix them. In the latter part of Isaiah's prophecy, chapters 40 to 66, we start hearing about this shadowy servant figure who takes it on himself to rescue his people. At first, it sounds like the servant is some sort of collective way of talking about Israel themselves, but then it becomes clear that this is actually an individual who is kind of doing a single combat warfare, so to speak, in the place of all of the people. Now, I've said before that God is like a master pool player. He calls his shots out before he makes them. 8-ball corner pocket. And then it happens just as he said. This is very much the case here. Isaiah's servant songs are a kind of shadowy sketch, almost like a silhouette, 800 years before the time of Christ, sketching the outline of the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. They shed light on who he is and what he came to do. And so on Good Friday, when we look at the vision of the cross, we read Isaiah 53 because it gives us a key into what's going on here. What's the significance of this that maybe no one else is actually seeing? What did he come to do? Well, Isaiah 52 and 53 says that the servant, Jesus, came to suffer. Chapter 52, verse 14 says that his appearance was marred beyond human semblance. He was dehumanized. Chapter 53, verse 3 says he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Isaiah uses violent words throughout to describe the servant's lot. He is oppressed and afflicted. He's stricken and crushed. He's cut off from the land of the living. The servant suffers. Jesus of Nazareth suffered. And nowhere did he suffer more than on that afternoon on the cross. But to what end? What was going on here? What was this for? Why did he suffer? Even an atheist will agree with the historical fact that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified, that he suffered. But why? What did it do? What did it accomplish? I want to focus specifically on Isaiah 53, verses 4 and 5 this afternoon, because in many ways this is the epicenter of the passage. And these verses tell us that Jesus, the servant, suffered as a substitute, as a representative, as the single combat warrior in our place, your place and my place and all the people of God's. And he bore our disease, he bore our betrayal, and he bore our crookedness. These are not ways that we often talk about sin, but these are ways that the Bible talks about sin. Our disease, our betrayal, and our crookedness. I want to say something about each. First, he bore our disease. Verse 4 says, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. We esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted." That word griefs means more than just sadness. It's not just an emotional word. In Hebrew, it refers to a sickness or a malady. He took up our sickness, our disease. He carried our sorrows. The scholar John Motyer writes that this means that he took upon himself, quote, all that mars our lives. Whether it's all of our painful health problems, our chronic diseases, our mental illness, our diminished lives, all that mars it, he bore. Around 1300 AD, there was a monastery planted in the village of Eisenheim in southeastern France. And back then, the region was plagued by this mysterious illness that people called St. Anthony's fire. They didn't know at the time what caused it. Later science has found that it was a fungus in the rye crop, and it was poisoning people. Essentially, among other symptoms, including insanity, victims were covered from head to toe in these painful sores. It restricted circulation, so people would get these painful sores that became infected and ultimately gangrenous. And so the monks, in response to all this suffering, started a hospital adjacent to their monastery. And the monastery became famous because in the chapel of the hospital, there is a painting by Matthias Grunwald. It's called The Crucifixion. And Grunwald, more than any other artist of his time, this is around 1500, painted the agony of Christ on the cross. Other artists would often try to make him look like he was all well put together and had his makeup just right for the event. Grunwald showed it like it is, but not exactly like it is. Because if you look closely at the painting, you see that Jesus' skin is covered from head to toe with black pockmarks. He bears the disease. This is the idea that Isaiah is getting at. The second half of verse 4 says that we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. Hebrew readers would have noticed that word stricken, and they would have remembered it from Leviticus chapters 13 and 14, which is all about skin diseases and leprosy. Stricken refers not necessarily to leprosy itself, but to the weight and the pain and the curse of leprosy. So what does it mean practically that Jesus Christ has borne our diseases? It means that he took the whole gamut of our human condition. Our loneliness and anxiety and trauma, our cancer and our chronic diseases, the grief that we feel over people who we have lost. All that happens to us in this world that mars our lives, both the sins of other people and just the pain of being a human in a broken world. He took it all, the sting of all of it, upon himself. Now, it would be comfortable to end the sermon right there. Jesus bears our sufferings, and you're all good cosmic protagonists. You just have a little bit of suffering. But if we want to see the fullness of the good news, we can't neglect the reality that he also bore the weight of our betrayal. This is the second point. Verse 5 says that he was pierced for our transgressions. That Hebrew word transgressions is pesha. It's used throughout the Bible to refer to trust breaking or treachery or betrayal. And so if you go back on your word, that's pesha. If you violate a pact or you cheat on your spouse or you tell the secret that your friend had entrusted to you, that's pesha. It's not just like ambiguous sort of disembodied sin. It's personal. The Bible's very clear that you and I are not just flawed but well-intentioned protagonists. We're not like Achilles, who just is great except for his heel, right? It's not that we aren't good enough for God. It's that we're actually consistently thwarting his ways and stabbing him in the back. And sometimes we do it in little ways, and sometimes we do it in really big ways too. The London Times once put out a call for editorials asking, what's the biggest problem in the world today? And G.K. Chesterton famously wrote in, "Dear sirs, I am." And somehow she makes it into every sermon of mine, but the famous Taylor Swift said, "It's me, I'm the problem, it's me." It's very self-aware. She says to her fans, it must be exhausting always rooting for the anti-hero. She gets it. Here's the truth. As long as you think of yourself as a good person, the cross is never going to make sense to you. It just isn't. If you have a vision of yourself as an upright, upstanding person with good moral values, who has conducted yourself well in the affairs of the world, and you've gotten yourself this far and your kids are turning out well because you did the right things, then the cross is never going to make sense to you. It just isn't. And I pray that we would all be disillusioned of that idol. Isaiah says that Jesus was pierced. That's the word for the death blow given to a Leviathan. He was dealt the death blow for our betrayal. He bore the punishment of our betrayal as a substitute. It's hard for us to imagine in the moment, but all sin has a cost. Now, Victor Hugo's epic Les Miserables deserves at least one mention in a sermon illustration per year, and this is it. So, sorry, Alex, you don't get the chance. After serving, it's just too good not to quote. After serving a lengthy prison term, the protagonist, Jean Valjean, is invited to stay the night with a local bishop. And in the middle of the night, after this wonderful dinner, Jean Valjean breaks into the kitchen hutch, and he steals all the silverware and breaks out into the night, fleeing with a bag full of priceless treasure. And Valjean looks a little suspicious, so he's apprehended by the police and dragged back to the bishop. And as he stares into the eyes of this man who has given him a place to stay, and he took everything, this is what the bishop says. "Well now, but how is this? I gave you the candlesticks too, which are of silver like the rest, and for which you can certainly get 200 francs. Why did you not carry them away with the spoons and forks?" Jean Valjean opened his eyes wide and stared at the venerable bishop with an expression which no human tongue can render any account of. "Monseigneur," said one of the officers. "So what this man said is true then? We came across him. He was walking like a man who is running away. We stopped him to look into the matter. He had this silver, and he told you," interposed the bishop with a smile, "that it had been given to him by a kind old fellow of a priest with whom he had passed in the night? I see how the matter stands. And you have brought him back here? It is a mistake." "In that case," replied the officer, "we can let him go?" "Certainly," replied the bishop. The officer released Jean Valjean, who recoiled. "Is it true that I am to be released?" he said in an almost inarticulate voice. "Yes, you are released," said one of the officers. "My friend," resumed the bishop, "before you go, here are your candlesticks. Take them." Jean Valjean was trembling in every limb. He took the 2 candlesticks mechanically and with a bewildered air. And the bishop looked him in the eye and said, "Jean Valjean, my brother, you no longer belong to evil, but to good. It is your soul that I buy from you. I withdraw it from the black thoughts and the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God. Friends, grace is never free, it's never free. It always has a price. Isaiah's point is that this servant, Jesus Christ, bore more than just our disease. He bore the price for our betrayal, and it cost him infinitely more than a pair of candlesticks. Finally, he also bore our crookedness, or our bentness, if you prefer the term. This is verse 5. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The Hebrew word for iniquities is avon. It's, in its simple expression, it just means bent. Psalm 38:6, for instance, the psalmist uses the root word of this to say that his back is bent over in grief. Have you ever felt like that? You're just bent over. More often, though, avon refers to moral or ethical bentness or crookedness. This is why we call someone of disreputable character or a criminal a crook, right? But more often, so sin is not just little s sins. It's not like, sin isn't just that you ate too much chocolate that you shouldn't have had, right? It's more than just not being perfect or occasionally doing the wrong thing. It's a curse. It is a bentness. The Apostle Paul says that sin is a power that enslaves you and enslaves me and takes over our lives and destroys us. The 4th century thinker Augustine said that the nature of sin is to be incurvatus in se, bent in upon oneself. This becomes really clear at the extremes of life. I had the opportunity when I was in the ordination process to serve as a hospital chaplain, and I went around from room to room to room. I would just go down the hall, and I found overwhelmingly that there were no moderate or normal experiences. It was either really, really great, and the person was in wonderful cheer, and there was optimism and hope. There were pictures of family surrounded, or it was just the blackest despair. There was no middle ground in the hospital room. It's almost like when the weight gets laid on and starts to crush, the bentness does one of two things. It either is healed or it just crumbles and becomes even more bent. That's what iniquity is, according to the Bible. Isaiah says that Jesus, the servant, was crushed on account of our bentness. He bore the consequences of all human distortion so that we could be made straight and upright again. And the upshot of this is liberating. It means that even our deepest perversity, you know, the thing that like nobody knows about, maybe if you come into a service, I'm sure that statistically there's somebody hiding something deep down, shameful. It means that or our bitterness and self-centeredness, or whatever way your humanity has been diminished, that is not beyond the scope of Jesus' atonement. No one comes in here with a full, healthy soul. And so we see that at the cross, Jesus bore the full weight of our disease and our betrayal and our crookedness. And when Isaiah says that he bore all this, it means literally he took it up, he picked it up and carried it. In a sense, he shouldered the weight. So Good Friday is not a tragedy. Jesus wasn't framed or forced into the cross. He wasn't compelled against his will. He willingly took this upon himself. Now, my favorite thing to say in church is the comfortable words, without question. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, Jesus says, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. I always used to think that what that really means is that Jesus has a teaching that's just more accommodating than other teachers. and that it's just a wise thing, and so if you follow the path of wisdom, it will go well with you, and that's all there is to it. Here's the thing, though. That's not why he says his yoke is easy and his burden is light. Jesus offers us the easy yoke, but someone had to take up the heavy one. And he came and looked down the gauntlet of an unbearable yoke and an unbearable burden, and he chose to shoulder it all by himself. He willingly took it up. He chose that. And so we have a Christ who has said, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Lay your burdens upon me. Burden me. Put it on my shoulders. I'll take it." And so on this Good Friday, I think that we can do no greater reverence to Christ than just to take him up on the offer. Amen.